So I want to welcome everyone to this week's class notes. With this week, I'm going to change what we've been doing in the past, in that for the class notes up to this point, I have really tried to focus more on talking through some of the skills related to writing about literature, reading literature, talking about preparing for the midterm exam, and sort of using what we've been reading as examples to illustrate some of the points that I've been making, but not really delving too deeply into some of the content-specific issues. This week, however, I want to talk about the British Empire a little bit. You're getting some of that through what you've been reading with the introductory and preparatory materials, but I just want to really kind of frame this week's primary text in terms of the empire, because I think doing so will really help you to think about not only sort of what's happening historically in this time period that we're reading about this week, but also to situate this primary text within the context of everything else that we're reading this semester. So with that in mind, I'm going to talk about the interesting narrative of Aloda Equiano in relationship to the British Empire, just to give you a little bit more information about that. So here we've got an image of the Union Jack, and this is a flag that, I think this flag was first used about a century later than the time period we're even looking at. But I want to sort of frame this by thinking about how we look back at the British Empire. So the beginnings of empire, from our contemporary vantage point, here in the year that we're in now, we can look back at the history of England as if the British Empire was inevitable, logically and intentionally orchestrated and monolithic. And often that's how we look back at history. We think, well, of course these things were going to happen because they happened. But there was nothing about the empire that was inevitable, nor was it planned as an empire as such. A lot of factors came into play, with many steps involved, many evolutions involved as it moved towards becoming what it became later on. And we'll see that later on there really is more of a sense of it being an empire that was managed. But even then, it was so large, so complicated, that it's not as simply as if there was a person in charge, or the king or queen could be in charge of empire. It's a lot more messy than that. So I kind of want to just look at some of the factors that led up to the empire. And the truth is very far from this myth of the empire as being like this single thing that was controlled by England. So in order to fully contextualize the interesting narrative, we must look back to understand the realities of British imperialism. So the seeds of the empire began with a number of factors that overlapped and fed into one another. We have attempts by England to rule over the Welsh, Scottish, and Irish peoples. With all of these factors, there's a lot more that I could say about them, but for the sake of where we're at right now, I want to keep things fairly straightforward. Any of these topics you could certainly read more about on your own, and some of them I might get into in a bit more detail later on in the semester. Obviously, this is one where we could talk in great detail, much more detail about exactly what the relationship was between the Welsh people, the Scottish people, and the Irish people, and England. We might think of those as being almost like internal colonies, even though they were part of the British Isles. In some ways, the Welsh, Scottish, and Irish people, the Irish in particular, and the Scottish, really did experience some of the same factors as people in other parts of the world who were colonized by the English. We also have improvements in the technology of ocean-going vessels. The bigger vessels you have, the longer they can go out to sea, the further they can go, the safer they are, the more exploring that you can do, the more places you can go to, the more things you can carry on board the ships. Other advancements that made long-distance travel by land and sea possible, including the ability to navigate safely, to carry supplies, to carry the necessary food, right? All of this made it, as we go through time, more accessible to travel the world, to do all the things that were necessary to begin establishing colonies overseas. Increased contact with the outside world during the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. We see this in some of the literature that we've been reading, and that trend definitely continues through this time period. The advent of scientific thinking and of branches of learning that spurred exploration. So we, for example, this week are reading about the Royal Society, about advances in science and other forms of learning that really helped to facilitate and to motivate a lot of the exploring that was going on during this time period. There are very strong financial incentives. This is probably one of the biggest factors at play here. An increasingly robust national economy. And I'll talk about that when we talk about the slave trade in just a moment. Obviously, the advantages of military strength gained by controlling land, people, and resources around the globe and at strategic locations. So this is obviously another major factor that helped to shape England's imperial project. And along with this, a developing sense of England's civilizing mission. And again, this is something that we'll talk more about as we get a little further along in the semester. But you have this idea that England and Europe in general, the Western world, was sort of like this beacon of civilization, of morality, of Christianity, and that part of the obligation of people going out, like missionaries, was to help civilize the rest of the world, to bring them under the Christian umbrella, to help teach them about English literature and the English language and English morality. So I wanted to frame this in terms also of the history of British imperialism, colonialism, and slavery. So as we kind of get into the 17th and 18th centuries, obviously the history of the British Empire is long and complex. The editors of our course textbook, of the Norton book, discuss different aspects of it at various points in the introductory sections that cover each period of British history. But it's challenging to get a good overview of that history. So as we're going through week by week, you're getting this history unfolding, but it's sometimes hard to kind of connect some of the dots across time periods. So here to help you do that are two extremely useful timelines to help you see this history. So look through them to better understand some of the key moments in the voyages of exploration, the establishment of colonies, the inhumanity of the slave trade, and the creation of what ultimately became the British Empire. So there's two links for you there. Take a look at them. Spend some time just playing around with them. You'll see they're set up very differently. The first one more clearly focuses on British Empire. I like the BBC one because it gives you all of British history. So you've got to be more thoughtful about looking for some key moments related to Empire specifically. But the BBC one is a little bit more user friendly. It's a little niftier, I think, in terms of how you can play around with it. But check them both out because that'll really help you to kind of see some of the key dates here with British history and with the British Empire. So for the slave trade itself, which obviously the interesting narrative focuses on, that narrative tells in part a story of one person's experience in the Middle Passage. So this term, Middle Passage, refers to the middle leg of a cycle of transportation whereby manufactured goods from England and other European nations was brought to Africa and exchanged for slaves who were then transported to the Americas. And by that we mean the Caribbean, South America, Central, North America, in exchange for where the African slaves were then exchanged for raw materials like sugar or tobacco. So these slaves were brought to the Americas and then sold into slavery there in exchange for some of these raw materials. These materials were then shipped back to ports in England and Europe. And obviously the New World, the Americas, were a major source of raw materials that were then brought back to Europe and then turned into the kinds of goods that were then exported to the rest of the world. So the Middle Passage was thus the voyage that brought the enslaved Africans to plantations in the Americas. The British Empire was built through the labor, the enslavement, the moral degradation of these African men, women, and children. Here you have some images of that depict this Middle Passage. So Equiano, whether he actually experienced them personally or not, describes in great detail the horrors of the Middle Passage, horrors that these images further testify to. So you can see some sketchings here of slaves being forced down into the hold of a ship. Right here, over here you have the image of the actual hold, and then you have a layout of here. This is like the design of a slave ship and how the slaves would be arranged in it, and you can see how tightly they are being packed in here, literally. The conditions there were horrible. This is something that if you're interested in, you can certainly read more about to learn even more than what we read about for this week, or what you're going to read about from the interesting narrative. So the way I want to end this is just to kind of return to this idea of what this all has to do with what we've been reading about with British history and British literature. And the way I want to frame that is by thinking about it in terms of knowledge, the individual, and the reality of imperial power. So this week, you're reading about some of the incredible advancements in science, technology, printing, medicine, transportation, and so on that took place in England in the second half of the 17th century and the 18th century. You are reading about the creation of the public sphere, the invention of the individual, and the creation of the novel as a literary genre, the debates held at the time about the role of government and the rights of the people, the explosion of literacy, and the many new forms of writing that accompanied this newly literate culture. And we'll see these trends only accelerate in the 19th century, which we'll read about next week. So it is critical, though, to always remember that behind all of these achievements of civilization, these celebrations of sentiment, these material advancements, exist the harsh, often violent realities of the empire building that was going on. Explorations of the range of human emotion, for instance, often assumed definitions of the human that were exclusively white, and often European, male, and middle upper class. To take another potent example, as British national identity started to take greater shape and cohesion during this period, that identity was defined against the dark-skinned others of non-Western countries. So we can't, in other words, think about the achievements of England separate from the empire, separate from its imperial designs. These are not distinguishable. They're totally tied together. So thus, Aquiano's narrative is a powerful counter-discourse to much of the literary and cultural climate of England during this period of time. A reminder that the history we are learning about is much more complex and harrowing than many of the people living through it at that time would have or could have acknowledged. So with all that in mind, I hope that helps you as you move through the reading about this period in history, and then when you read the interesting narrative, it's something we will take up in the discussion board as well. I'm sure people will have a lot to say this week about the reading about British Empire and how this fits into some of the other changes that are going on during this time period. So I look forward to all of that, and thank you all very much.